March 15, 1967. Dense jungle 2 kilometers west of fire support base buttons, Binh Duong Province, South Vietnam. The heat pressed down like a physical weight. Specialist 4th Class Michael Kern moved through the triple canopy jungle with his M79 grenade launcher cradled across his chest, every sense straining against the oppressive silence. Behind him, 8 men from 2nd Squad, Bravo Company, 2nd Battalion, 28th Infantry Regiment, the Black Lions, pushed through vegetation so thick it swallowed light. Water dripped from enormous leaves overhead. The air tasted of rot and copper. Kern's fatigues were soaked through, his boots caked in red mud that tried to suck them off with every step. The M79 weighed just 6 pounds, but after 4 hours of patrol it felt like 20. Break action, single shot, aluminum and steel. It looked almost toy-like compared to the M16s the riflemen carried. Some guys back at base called it the elephant gun. Most called it the blooper for the sound it made when fired. A sound Kern had come to respect. Point man, Private Rodriguez froze. His fist shot up. The signal rippled back through the file. Every man dropped, weapon ready, scanning the green wall that surrounded them. Kern's thumb moved to the M79's barrel latch, muscle memory checking that a high explosive round was chambered. It was. It always was. 30 seconds of silence. A bird called somewhere in the canopy. Then Rodriguez's hand moved again. Enemy movement 50 meters, 11 o'clock. Lieutenant Fisher, crouched 15 feet behind Rodriguez, turned his head slowly. His eyes found Kern. 2 fingers pointed ahead, then a circular motion. Kern nodded. He knew the drill. He'd been the squad's grenadier for 7 months, long enough to know that when things went sideways, everyone would be screaming his name. The first AK-47 burst shattered the jungle quiet like breaking glass. Rodriguez went down. The rest of 2nd Squad returned fire instantly, muzzle flashes strobing through the undergrowth. Kern couldn't see the enemy. He never could in this goddamn jungle, but he could hear them. The distinctive crack of Kalashnikov rifles, maybe 6 or 7, firing from a tree line they couldn't even see. Green tracers snapped through the foliage, clipping leaves, thudding into tree trunks. "Grenadier up! Grenadier up!" Sergeant Patterson's voice cut through the chaos. Kern was already moving, staying low, the M79 gripped tight. He duck-walked forward past 2 riflemen who were pouring fire into the green wall. Patterson grabbed his shoulder, pulled him down behind a massive mahogany trunk. "Tree line! Base of that strangler fig. You see it?" Kern saw it. 70 meters out, maybe 75. At the edge of his effective range, he could see muzzle flashes now, orange blooms in the shadows. The NVA were dug in, probably spider holes or a prepared position. This was their ground. He broke open the M79 with a practiced snap, checked the round, even though he knew what was there. The fat 40mm grenade looked like a stubby shotgun shell. High explosive, arming range 14 to 27 meters. After that, the round was live. Maximum effective range against point targets, 350 meters. But accurate. That was about skill. Kern rose to one knee. The firing intensified. The NVA had spotted movement. Rounds whip-cracked over his head. He ignored them. Tunnel vision now. Just him and the target. He shouldered the M79, more like a shotgun than a rifle. No scope, just a simple flip-up sight. He'd done this hundreds of times in training, dozens in combat. The sight picture had to account for the arching trajectory. The 40mm round traveled in a rainbow arc, not a straight line. Kern's brain did the math automatically now. Distance, angle, wind, vegetation. He squeezed the trigger. Bloop. The sound was almost gentle, incongruous with its purpose. A soft pneumatic pop, like a cork leaving a champagne bottle. The M79 kicked, not hard but firm, and Kern was already breaking the action open, the spent casing ejecting with a metallic tink as it hit a root. 3 seconds. That's how long it took. The 40mm round arced through the jungle, tumbling end over end. Somewhere in the green hell ahead, a North Vietnamese soldier who'd heard that sound before was throwing himself sideways, knowing exactly what it meant. The explosion cracked like thunder, concentrated into a single point. Shrapnel screamed through the trees in a 10-meter kill radius. The enemy fire from that position stopped. But there were more. Always more. "Another 50 meters right!" Patterson's hand pointed. Kern already had a fresh round from his vest. He, again, slid it home, snapped the action closed. He shifted his aim point, found the new target through the foliage. Another muzzle flash, another spider hole. Bloop! The second round was away. Another 3-second flight. Another explosion that turned jungle into shrapnel. Another position silenced. The enemy fire was slackening now. The NVA knew what the soft bloop sound meant just as well as Kern did. It meant someone was about to die, and there was nothing they could do to stop the round once they heard it. They could dive, they could run, but the grenade was already in flight. That's what made the M79 special. Not its power, plenty of weapons hit harder. Not its range, rifles reached further. It was the mathematics of inevitability. When you heard the bloop, you had maybe 3 seconds to move. Maybe. The jungle went quiet again except for the ringing in everyone's ears and Rodriguez groaning somewhere up front. Kern had 4 rounds left in his vest. His hands were steady as he reloaded, chambering another HE round, scanning for targets. The M79 was ready. He was ready. Somewhere in the jungle ahead, an NVA soldier who'd survived the barrage was already passing the word, "Blooper. They have a blooper. Stay down." The M79 grenade launcher that Michael Kern carried through the jungles of Vietnam in 1967 had been born from frustration 9 years earlier, half a world away, in the sterile laboratories and proving grounds of the United States Army. Springfield Armory, Massachusetts. November 1958. The problem was as old as modern infantry combat itself, the gap. Every squad had rifles that could reach out to 300 meters, maybe 400 if you had a good marksman. They had mortars that could drop rounds at 800 meters and beyond. But between those ranges, that deadly middle ground where so much combat actually happened, there was nothing. A squad pinned down by a machine gun 200 meters away had exactly 2 choices: call for mortar support and wait, or assault directly into the fire. Both options got men killed. The Army had tried to fill this gap for decades. In World War II, riflemen fired rifle grenades, little explosive rounds that fitted over the muzzle of an M1 Garand. They were inaccurate, awkward, and required a special blank cartridge to launch. Korea saw the same weapon with the same problems. By the mid-1950s, Army ordnance officers knew there had to be a better solution. Project Niblick, the code name said it all. A Niblick was a golf club designed for short, high-arcing shots. That's exactly what the Army wanted, a weapon that could lob an explosive round in a high arc over obstacles precisely on target without the complexity of a mortar or the awkwardness of a rifle grenade. The specifications were demanding. The weapon had to be light enough for one man to carry all day, simple enough that any soldier could learn to use it, reliable enough to function in mud, sand, water, and ice, accurate enough to hit a window at 150 meters, powerful enough to kill enemy soldiers in a wide radius. And it had to do all of this while weighing less than 7 pounds. The engineers at Springfield Armory went through dozens of prototypes, break-action designs like a shotgun, pump-action repeaters, even some bizarre revolving designs that looked like something from a science fiction magazine. They tested different barrel lengths, different sighting systems, different ammunition types. The proving grounds echoed with bloops and explosions for months. By early 1960, they'd settled on the final design, a break-action single-shot launcher with a rifled aluminum barrel and a simple wooden or plastic stock. It looked almost primitive, more like a sawed-off shotgun than a modern weapon. The 40mm ammunition was ingenious, a low-pressure cartridge that used a high-low pressure system where most of the propellant burned in a chamber inside the casing, producing a gentle push rather than a violent explosion. This meant the launcher itself could be lightweight aluminum rather than heavy steel. The sound it made was unavoidable, a consequence of that low-pressure system. When fired, the M79 produced a distinctive hollow bloop that carried surprisingly far in the open. During testing, some officers worried this would give away the shooter's position, but the ordnance engineers argued that by the time you heard the bloop, the round was already in flight. 3 seconds later, it would explode. There was no time to pinpoint the shooter and return effective fire. They called it the M79 grenade launcher. The official designation was boring, bureaucratic. The soldiers who first trained on it at Fort Benning had other names. Fort Benning, Georgia. August 1961. "Looks like a damn elephant gun," Private First Class Danny Morrison said, holding the M79 at arm's length like it might bite him. His drill instructor, Sergeant First Class Williams, was not amused. "It's a 40mm precision weapon system, Morrison. It'll put a grenade through a window at 150 meters while you're standing up. Your M1 Garand couldn't do that if you were prone with sandbags." Morrison broke it open, peered down the barrel. "How's it work, Sergeant?" Williams took the M79, pulled a training round from his pouch, blue painted to indicate inert. He loaded it with a smooth motion, snapped the action closed. "Simple. You see the target. You estimate the range. You aim high because this round arcs like a baseball. You squeeze the trigger." He pointed downrange at a target silhouette 100 meters away. "And you listen." He fired. Bloop. The sound rolled across the range, weirdly gentle. 3 seconds later, the blue training round hit the dirt 5 feet behind the target, kicking up red Georgia clay. "That's why we call it the blooper," Williams said. "You'll hear that sound in your sleep after a few hundred rounds. Now you try." Morrison took the launcher back, fumbled with a training round. It took him 3 tries to load it smoothly. He shouldered the weapon, aimed at the target, squeezed. Bloop. His round fell short by 20 meters. "Again," Williams said. Morrison loaded, fired. Short again. The M79 was deceptively difficult. The arcing trajectory meant you had to aim well above the target, and every range required a different sight picture. It wasn't point and shoot. It was geometry and instinct combined. By the end of the week, Morrison was hitting man-sized targets at 150 meters 7 times out of 10. Williams nodded approval. "You're a grenadier now, son. Every squad needs one. When you get to whatever shit war they send you to next, you're gonna be the most popular guy in your unit. Or the most cussed. Depends on whether you hit what you're aiming at." The M79 began deploying to Army units in late 1961. The Marines got theirs in 1962. By 1963, the first grenadiers were arriving in South Vietnam as part of the growing advisory mission. They were a curiosity at first, American advisors showing their South Vietnamese counterparts this strange weapon that looked like a toy, but hit like artillery. The Viet Cong first encountered the M79 in late 1963 in small skirmishes in the Mekong Delta. The initial reactions were recorded in captured documents and prisoner interrogations. The VC didn't know what to make of it. The sound was unlike anything they'd heard. The explosions appeared seemingly random. Sometimes the rounds came in low and flat, sometimes high and arcing. It didn't sound like a mortar, it didn't look like a rifle grenade, and it seemed to fire from impossible angles. By 1965, when the first American combat units deployed in force, the M79 went with them. 1 grenadier per squad, sometimes 2. They carried the launcher and 30 to 40 rounds of mixed ammunition, high explosive, white phosphorus for marking targets or creating smoke, buckshot rounds for close-in work, illumination rounds for night operations. The North Vietnamese Army encountered American grenadiers during the Ia Drang Valley campaign in November 1965. Those battles, the first major engagements between U.S. and NVA forces, taught both sides hard lessons. For the NVA, one lesson stood out. When you heard that soft, hollow bloop sound, you had seconds to move or die. They began calling it Sung Phong Lu in formal reports, grenade launcher. But among the troops, another name emerged. Tieng Bloop, the bloop sound, or simply blooper, borrowed from the Americans themselves. The name was almost affectionate, but the fear was real, because unlike rifle fire or machine guns, which could be dodged or avoided by taking cover, the M79's rounds arced over obstacles. They came from above. A soldier safe behind a tree trunk from rifle fire could be killed by a 40mm grenade that sailed over his cover and exploded behind it. The weapon turned traditional cover into death traps. By 1966, captured NVA training documents included specific sections on the M79. How to recognize the sound, how to estimate the shooter's position, how to scatter immediately when you heard it. The documents emphasized one critical point: do not stay in place. The moment you hear the bloop, move. The round is already in flight and cannot be stopped, but you might get outside the kill radius if you're fast. The psychological impact was enormous. Experienced NVA soldiers could distinguish the bloop of an M79 from hundreds of other battlefield sounds, and that recognition triggered an immediate, almost instinctive reaction. Dive, scatter, run, even if it meant breaking cover and exposing yourself to rifle fire. Because rifle fire you might survive. A 40mm HE round exploding in your position, you would not. Back at Fire Support Base Buttons in March 1967, Michael Kern knew none of this history as he reloaded his M79 after the ambush. He didn't know about Project Niblick or the Proving Grounds at Springfield Armory. He didn't know that NVA training cadres were teaching recruits to fear the sound his weapon made. All he knew was that when he fired, enemies died or scattered, and in the jungle where visibility was measured in meters, not hundreds of yards, that made him one of the most valuable men in his squad. The medevac chopper had taken Rodriguez away 20 minutes ago. The squad was moving again, slower now, more cautious. Kern's M79 was loaded with HE, safety off, ready. His vest held 23 more rounds, enough for a sustained firefight if they got hit again. Somewhere ahead in the jungle, NVA soldiers were reporting back to their commanders. Americans on patrol, squad-sized element, and yes, they have a blooper. The warning would ripple through their network, positions would be abandoned or reinforced, ambush sites would be relocated, all because of a weapon that weighed 6 pounds and made a sound like a cartoon character. Jois, Fort Polk, Louisiana, January 1967. 2 months before Kern's patrol near Fire Support Base Buttons. The morning fog hung over the range like cotton wool, burning off slowly under a winter sun that gave light, but no warmth. 23 soldiers stood in a ragged line, their breath visible in the cold air, each holding an M79 grenade launcher that still smelled of packing grease and cosmoline. Michael Kern was among them. He'd been in country exactly 0 days, had exactly 0 combat experience, and had been selected as his platoon's grenadier for reasons he still didn't fully understand. He was average height, average build, decent rifle scores, but nothing spectacular. Yesterday he'd been just another rifleman. Today he held a weapon that could kill a dozen men with a single round. Staff Sergeant Raymond Price walked the line, his boots crunching on frost-stiff grass. Price had 2 tours in Vietnam already, one with the 1st Infantry Division, one with the 173rd Airborne. The combat infantryman badge on his chest was accompanied by a Purple Heart and a Bronze Star. When he spoke, everyone listened. "Forget everything you know about aiming a rifle," Price said. His voice carried in the cold air without him having to shout. "The M79 doesn't work like a rifle. It's not direct fire, it's indirect. The round goes up, then comes down. You're throwing an explosive baseball, and you need to throw it exactly where you want it to land." He pulled a 40mm training round from his pouch, blue-tipped, inert, but identical in weight and ballistics to the real thing. "This weighs half a pound. When you fire, it leaves the barrel at 250 feet per second. That's slow. A rifle bullet goes 3 times that fast. This round is going to arc through the air like you threw it, except you're throwing it with precision." Price loaded his M79 with practiced efficiency. Break the action, insert round, snap closed. The movements were smooth, economical. "Watch the trajectory." He aimed at a target silhouette 150 meters downrange, the barrel angled up at what looked like 30 degrees. Too high, Kern thought. Way too high. Bloop. The sound echoed across the range. Kern watched the round's flight. You could actually track it with your eyes at that speed, a dark blur arcing through the gray morning sky. 3 seconds. The round impacted 2 feet from the silhouette, exactly where Price had aimed. "Now you," Price said. For the next hour they fired, and fired, and fired. The blue training rounds were expensive. Each one cost the Army $8, but the brass had learned in blood that undertrained grenadiers got people killed. So they burned through hundreds of rounds, learning the arc, learning the timing, learning how to estimate range by eye. Kern's first shot fell 40 meters short, his second went 20 meters long, his third hit 15 meters right. It was maddening. With his M16, he could hit targets at 200 meters using the sights and basic marksmanship principles. The M79 required something else entirely, a feel for the weapon, an instinct for the trajectory. "Stop thinking," Price said, appearing at Kern's shoulder after his 10th miss. "You're calculating. Don't calculate. Look at the target. See where you want the round to land. Your brain knows how to throw things. You've been throwing since you were 2 years old. Trust it." Kern loaded another training round. He looked at the target, 125 meters away now. They'd moved to a different firing position. He didn't think about angles or trajectories. He just looked at the spot where he wanted the round to land, raised the M79, and fired. Bloop! The round hit 5 feet from the target, closer than he'd gotten all morning. "Again," Price said. By the end of day 1, Kern was hitting man-sized targets at 150 meters 4 times out of 10. By the end of day 3, it was 7 out of 10. By the end of week 1, he could hit targets from 50 to 200 meters with what felt like casual precision. The M79 had become an extension of his body, the arc of the round as natural as pointing his finger. But accuracy was only part of training. Speed mattered just as much. Price timed them with a stopwatch. Break action, extract spent casing, load new round, close action, aim, fire. A good grenadier could do this in under 5 seconds. An excellent one could do it in 3. Kern managed 4 seconds by the end of week 1, 3.5 by the end of week 2. In combat, those seconds matter, Price told them during a classroom session, rain drumming on the Quonset hut roof. You fire your first round, you hit or you miss, doesn't matter. What matters is getting your second round out before the enemy relocates. Charlie isn't stupid. He hears the bloop. He knows what's coming. If he's smart, he's moving before your first round even lands. Your second round needs to anticipate where he's moving to. Price pulled down a tactical map showing a hypothetical ambush scenario. You're here. Enemy machine gun is here, 100 meters out, firing from behind a berm. You fire your first round. Where do you aim? At the machine gun position, Sergeant, someone said. Wrong. You aim behind it. The gun team knows you're targeting them. The instant they hear your bloop, they're going to displace backward, deeper behind the berm. Your first round explodes where they were. Your second round, which you're loading right now fast as you can, lands where they are. That's how you get kills. The ammunition itself was a course of study. The basic HE round, high explosive, was the workhorse. Each one contained 30 grams of Composition B explosive wrapped in a steel shell that fragmented into hundreds of pieces. Kill radius, 5 meters. Casualty radius, 15 meters. Anything within that 5-meter circle was dead or dying. Anything within 15 meters was wounded, sometimes catastrophically. But he wasn't the only option. White phosphorus rounds, Willie Pete, burned at 5,000 degrees and created massive white smoke clouds. They were officially for marking targets or creating smoke screens. Unofficially, they were psychological weapons. WP stuck to skin and burned through to bone. The Geneva Conventions had rules about using it directly against personnel, but in the chaos of jungle combat, those rules became flexible. If a WP round accidentally hit an enemy position, well, that was unfortunate. Buckshot rounds turned the M79 into the world's largest shotgun. Each round contained 27 0 buck pellets. Effective range, 50 meters. It was for close-in work, jungle ambushes, nighttime perimeter defense. At 30 meters, a buckshot round could saw a man in half. Illumination rounds were for night operations. They burst at a preset altitude and floated down on parachutes, bathing to the battlefield in harsh white light for 40 seconds. Kern fired 3 during night training, watching the jungle transform from absolute darkness to stark shadows in an instant. You carry mixed loads, Price explained, showing them how to pack their grenadier vests. 24 rounds minimum, 18 HE, 3 WP, 2 buckshot, 1 illumination. That's standard. Some guys carry all HE, some carry extra buckshot if they're working canals or dense jungle. You figure out what works for you. The vest itself was critical. Purpose-built grenadier vests had rows of pouches sized exactly for 40mm rounds. Each round slid into its own pocket, accessible without looking. Kern practiced loading in the dark until he could grab any round by touch alone. Rounds were smooth. WP had a slightly different texture. Buckshot had ridges. Illumination was longer. His fingers learned to distinguish them instantly. Physical conditioning was part of training, too. The M79 was light, but 24 rounds of 40mm ammunition weighed 12 pounds. Add that to a basic combat load, rifle ammunition for the backup weapon most grenadiers carried, grenades, water, rations, medical supplies, and you were humping 70 pounds through jungle terrain. They ran with full loads, they climbed obstacles, they low-crawled through mud. In Vietnam, you'll be walking 10-12 miles a day, Price said during a forced march that left everyone gasping, in 100-degree heat. In humidity that makes you feel like you're breathing through a wet blanket. Every pound matters, but you will carry those grenade rounds, and you will carry enough of them because when your squad gets hit, they will be screaming your name. The psychological preparation was subtler but just as important. Price brought in veterans to talk, grenadiers who'd served their tours and survived. They spoke honestly about what combat felt like, what it meant to kill men you couldn't even see, what it sounded like when the shrapnel from your round tore through human bodies. One veteran, Specialist Davis, had a scar running from his temple to his jaw. "You're going to miss sometimes," he said flatly. "You're going to fire at enemy positions and hit nothing but dirt. You're going to fire at bunkers and watch your rounds bounce off, and worst, you're going to fire at targets your squad leader calls, and you're going to find out later you hit civilians. Wrong place, wrong time, wrong intelligence. It'll haunt you, but you still have to fire, because the next target might be real, and if you hesitate, Americans die." Kern listened to these talks with growing unease. He joined the Army for college money and because his draft number was coming up anyway. Vietnam had seemed abstract, distant, a problem happening on television. Now it was 8 weeks away and becoming more real every day. The final test came at the end of week 3, a live-fire exercise designed to simulate combat conditions as closely as training could manage. Pop-up targets at unknown ranges, time pressure, simulated artillery fire, loudspeakers blasting explosions to create confusion and stress, squad members shouting contradictory commands, smoke grenades reducing visibility to 10 meters. Kern's hands shook as he loaded his first live HE round. Not a blue-tipped trainer, but the real thing. Olive drab casing, lethal payload. He broke the action, slid the round home, snapped it closed. "Target, 150 meters, tree line!" Price's voice cut through the chaos. Kern saw the pop-up silhouette, aimed, fired, bloop. 3 seconds felt like 3 hours. Then the explosion, sharper, louder, more violent than training rounds. The pop-up silhouette disintegrated. Shrapnel hummed through the air. The concussion was a physical blow even at 150 meters. "Target down. New target, 100 meters right." Kern was already reloading. Muscle memory. Break, load, close, aim, fire, bloop. Another explosion, another kill. By the end of the exercise, he'd fired 18 rounds, 14 hits, 4 misses. Price walked up as Kern stood there shaking, adrenaline draining away, leaving him hollow. 14 out of 18, Price said. "That's better than most. But here's what you need to understand, Kern. Those targets were plywood. In Vietnam, they'll be men. Young men, mostly. Scared kids just like you, except they're trying to kill you and everyone you care about. You're going to blow them apart with this weapon. You're going to see what 40 mm HE does to human bodies. And you're going to do it again and again because that's the job." Kern nodded, not trusting his voice. "Can you do this job?" Price asked. Kern thought about his squad mates, the guys he'd trained with for 16 weeks. He thought about Rodriguez, the point man he'd be walking behind in a month. He thought about the weight of the M79 in his hands and the responsibility it carried. "Yes, Sergeant." "Good. Because in 2 weeks you're on a plane to Bien Hoa, and 2 days after that you'll be humping through the jungle for real. The blooper you're carrying will be the difference between your squad walking out alive or going home in body bags." Price pulled a worn notebook from his pocket. "I'm going to give you something I wish someone had given me before my first tour. Real combat notes, what works, what doesn't, things you can't learn on a range." He flipped through pages covered in cramped handwriting. "Number 1. Always keep 1 round of buckshot accessible. When you're walking point or trail, keep it in your hand. If you get hit at close range, you won't have time to fumble for HE. Buckshot is instant. Number 2. Learn to estimate range by counting steps. In jungle, you can't see far enough to judge distance normally. Walk the terrain when you can, count your steps to landmarks. Build a mental map. Number 3. The bloop sound carries far. The enemy will hear it and try to pinpoint you. Fire and move, always. Never fire twice from the same position unless you're in a fixed defense. Number 4, respect the arming range, 14 to 27 meters. Inside that, your rounds are duds. I've seen grenadiers panic and fire at enemies 10 meters away, then watch the round bounce off someone's chest without exploding. Carry a rifle or pistol as backup." The list went on. 20 items, each one purchased with someone's blood or near-death experience. Kern copied every word into his own notebook, knowing he'd be reading it in a foxhole somewhere in Vietnam, hearing the bloop of his own weapon echoing through hostile jungle. 2 weeks later, he was on a C-130 transport heading west across the Pacific. The M79 was packed in his duffel, cleaned and oiled. 24 rounds of mixed ammunition were in his grenadier vest. Staff Sergeant Price's notebook was in his breast pocket. He'd fired 847 training rounds and 132 live rounds in 3 weeks. He could hit targets from 50 to 250 meters. He could load and fire in under 4 seconds. He knew the ballistics, the capabilities, the limitations. But he didn't know what it would feel like to hear enemy soldiers screaming after his round exploded in their position. He didn't know what it would smell like, that mix of explosive, blood, and torn jungle that would become sickeningly familiar. He didn't know that the soft bloop of his weapon would become a comfort sound to his squad mates and a terror sound to the enemy. He would learn all of that in the jungle outside Fire Support Base Buttons, starting with his first contact on March 15, 1967. Quang Tri Province, South Vietnam, June 1965. 21 months before Kern's firefight, the first time North Vietnamese Army soldier Nguyen Van Thieu heard the M79, he thought someone had dropped a cooking pot. He was 19 years old, 2 months in country after a 6-week march down the Ho Chi Minh Trail that had killed 3 men in his company from disease and 1 from a tiger attack. His unit, a reinforced company of the 95th Regiment, had dug in along a ridgeline overlooking a valley where American advisors and ARVN troops were conducting operations. The position was good. Thick jungle cover, interlocking fields of fire, spider holes with overhead cover, camouflaged so well that American aircraft had flown over 3 times without spotting them. Thieu was in his spider hole, a narrow pit barely wider than his shoulders, 4 feet deep with a roof of logs and earth. When he heard a sound from the valley below that made no sense, a hollow thump, like bamboo knocking against bamboo, almost gentle. What was that? He whispered to Duke, in the hole 3 meters to his left. Duke shook his head. Neither of them had heard anything like it in training or in their limited combat experience. It wasn't rifle fire. It wasn't a mortar. Those made a distinct metallic clunk when they launched. It wasn't artillery. It was just bloop. 3 seconds later, the jungle 40 meters to their right exploded. The blast was enormous, disproportionate to the soft sound that had preceded it. Trees shattered. Earth and debris fountained into the air. A man screamed, "La," who'd been covering the right flank. The screaming continued for 5 seconds, then stopped abruptly. "What?" Thieu started to say. Bloop. There it was again. That same soft sound from the valley. Thieu pressed himself to the bottom of his spider hole, hands over his head as if that would help. 3 seconds. He counted them without meaning to. 1, 2, 3. The explosion came 30 meters to his left, closer. Another man screamed. The smell of explosive and torn vegetation rolled over the position. Bloop! Thieu scrambled out of his spider hole, abandoning his weapon, abandoning everything. He ran deeper into the jungle, branches tearing at his uniform, his only thought to get away from that sound. That horrible soft sound that meant death was already in the air, already falling, and there was nothing you could do but run and pray it landed somewhere else. Behind him, the American advisors and ARVN troops assaulted the position. Thieu's company broke and scattered. They'd lost 8 men killed, 12 wounded, not to rifle fire or machine guns or airstrikes, but to that strange weapon that made the gentle bloop sound. That night, huddled in a rally point 5 kilometers away, the survivors tried to make sense of what had happened. Their lieutenant, a veteran of the war against the French, had never seen anything like it. Some kind of mortar, he speculated, but fired from the shoulder, very small, very mobile. It came from the valley, Duke said. I saw the American formation, 1 man with a strange weapon, like a short rifle with a fat barrel. The lieutenant wrote this in his after-action report. The report went up through channels, from company to battalion to regiment to division. Other reports were arriving too. Encounters with this new American weapon were increasing. The descriptions were consistent. A single soldier carrying what looked like an oversized pistol or a cut-down shotgun. A distinctive, hollow sound when it fired. Explosive rounds that arced through the air and detonated with devastating effect. By late 1965, the NVA had a name for it. Sung Phong Lu, grenade launcher. The Americans called it M79. Intelligence officers studied captured rounds and produced technical assessments, 40mm diameter, high explosive, fragmentation effect, kill radius approximately 5 meters. They estimated range at 300-400 meters, though this was uncertain. What was certain was that the weapon was changing tactics. Traditional ambush positions, concealed, dug in with good fields of fire, were suddenly vulnerable. The grenade launcher could put rounds behind cover over berms into spider holes. A position that would withstand rifle fire could be destroyed by a single well-placed 40mm round. A Shao Valley, South Vietnam, March 1966. By the spring of 1966, the NVA had fought enough engagements with American forces to develop counter-tactics. Senior Lieutenant Pham Duc Quan, a company commander with the 2nd Regiment, gathered his platoon leaders for a training session in a base camp 20 kilometers inside Laos. The American grenade launcher, Quan said, pointing to a crude diagram scratched in the dirt, is effective from 50 to 350 meters. Inside 50 meters, the rounds don't arm. They bounce off like stones. Beyond 350 meters, accuracy drops significantly. This creates 2 tactical responses. He looked at his platoon leaders, making sure they understood. First option, close the range immediately. When you initiate an ambush, do it from inside 50 meters if possible. Rush the Americans before their grenadier can react. Kill him first if you can identify him. He usually carries a strange weapon and wears a vest with many pouches. Second option, increase the range. Position your ambushes at 400 meters or more. Use long-range rifles. Make them come to you across open ground where they're vulnerable. One of the platoon leaders, Levan Min, raised his hand. Comrade Lieutenant, what about the sound? When we hear the blooper fire, what do we do? This was the critical question. Quan had thought hard about this. When you hear the bloop sound, you have approximately 3 seconds before the round impacts. This is not enough time to run far, but it is enough time to take action. If you are in a spider hole, stay in it and press yourself to the bottom. The overhead cover may save you. If you are in an open position, throw yourself sideways in any direction. The kill radius is small. 5 meters of movement might save your life. But never freeze. The men who freeze are the men who die. Min nodded, but his expression was troubled. The sound carries very far, Comrade Lieutenant. We hear it and we know death is coming, but we don't know where. It affects morale. Quan couldn't argue with this. He'd seen it himself, veteran soldiers flinching at the bloop sound, even when the round landed nowhere near them. The psychological effect was significant. The weapon announced itself, gave you a moment of horrible anticipation, then killed you. It was psychological warfare whether the Americans intended it or not. This is why we must kill the grenadiers, Quan said. They are not officers, not special troops. They are ordinary soldiers with specialized weapons, but they have an outsized effect on combat. One grenadier can suppress an entire squad. Priority targets, machine gunners first, then grenadiers. Eliminate them and the Americans lose much of their firepower advantage. The tactics spread through the NVA, captured documents from 1966 and 1967 show detailed sections on the M79. Training camps devoted entire classes to identifying the weapon and the soldiers who carried it. Snipers were instructed to target grenadiers. Ambushes were planned with the specific goal of killing the grenadier in the first volley. It didn't always work. American squads protected their grenadiers, kept them in the center of formations, gave them covering fire when they exposed themselves to shoot. And the grenadiers themselves learned to be unpredictable, firing from different positions, using terrain to mask their location, varying their timing. But the NVA scored successes too. Records show 89 grenadiers killed in action in 1966, 127 in 1967. Every grenadier killed meant a squad lost significant firepower until a replacement arrived. Some units went weeks without a trained grenadier, relying on riflemen who'd been given a hasty 15-minute course on the weapon. Con Tum Province, South Vietnam. September 1966. The evolution of tactics worked both ways. American grenadiers learned from experience just as the NVA did. Specialist James Tucker, grenadier for 1st Squad, Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 12th Infantry Regiment, had survived 7 months in country by learning what worked and what got you killed. He'd started his tour following the textbook tactics from training. He'd learned better. First round is always he behind their position, Tucker explained to the new grenadier replacement, a kid named Patterson, fresh from Fort Polk. They were sitting in a perimeter at Fire Support Base 12, cleaning weapons after a 3-day patrol. Charlie hears the bloop. He displaces backward, deeper into cover. Your first round goes where he was, but you're already loading your second round, and that one goes where he is now. Patterson nodded, trying to memorize everything. What if they charge? Then you switch to buckshot, fast as you can. Keep 1 round in your hand at all times when you're on patrol. Not in your vest, in your hand. Buckshot for close range. When you need it now, not 5 seconds from now. Tucker held up his left hand, showing how he carried a 40mm buckshot round gripped in his palm, ready to load. "This has saved my ass twice." "The LT says don't fire from the same position twice," Patterson said. "The LT is right. You fire, you move. 10 meters, 15 if you can. Charlie is trying to spot you by sound and muzzle position. Fire and move, always. Only exception is if we're in a fixed perimeter defense. Then you stay put because there's nowhere to move to." Tucker pulled out a map marked with his own annotations, penciled circles and notes that would mean nothing to anyone else. "Learn the terrain. When we patrol, I'm counting steps, marking distances in my head. See that tree line? I know it's 100 to 80 meters from our usual patrol route. If we get hit from there, I don't have to estimate range. I already know. I've got the sight picture in my head before I even raise the weapon." "You aim for the sound," Tucker continued. "Most of the time, you can't see Charlie, jungle's too thick, but you hear his AK firing, you see his muzzle flash, and that's your target. Don't wait to spot an actual person. Fire at the source of the incoming 3-round barrage, behind, center, front. Walk your rounds through the position. One of them will hit, and even if it doesn't, you've suppressed the position. That's half the battle, making Charlie put his head down so our riflemen can maneuver." Patterson absorbed this, but he looked uncertain. "How do you deal with... when you hit someone, how do you..." "Don't think about it during contact," Tucker said flatly. "You think about it at night, later, when you can't sleep. During the fight, you're just putting rounds on target. That's the job. You're protecting your squad. These guys..." He gestured to the men cleaning weapons around them. "They depend on you. Sergeant Mills calls your name, you deliver. That's all that matters in the moment." This was the reality of the grenadiers' role by mid-1966. The tactical employment had evolved far beyond the basics taught in training. Grenadiers developed personal techniques, squad-specific strategies, terrain-dependent tactics. They learned to read the jungle, to anticipate enemy movement, to coordinate with machine gunners and riflemen in a deadly synchronized dance. The NVA adapted too. By late 1966, they were using decoy positions, a single soldier who would fire a few rounds to draw grenade fire, while the main force stayed hidden. They learned to spread out more, to avoid clustering in positions where a single 40mm round could kill multiple men. They built spider holes with better overhead cover using logs thick enough to deflect shrapnel. They also learned to exploit the M79's limitations. The 14-meter minimum arming range became a tactical factor. NVA assault tactics emphasized closing to within 50 meters as quickly as possible, getting inside the grenadiers' effective range. Some units carried grappling hooks and rope to rapidly scale obstacles, closing the distance before the Americans could react. Tay Ninh Province, South Vietnam. January 1967. The escalation continued. By early 1967, both sides had 2 years of hard-won experience with the M79. The weapon had become a fixture of American infantry tactics, as fundamental as the M60 machine gun or the M16 rifle. Every squad had a grenadier. Every grenadier had developed his own style, his own tricks, his own superstitions. For the NVA, the bloop sound had become one of the defining sounds of the war, like the whop-whop of Huey helicopters or the shriek of F-4 Phantom jets. Veterans could distinguish it from hundreds of meters away, could judge roughly how far away the grenadier was, could estimate where the round would land based on the trajectory and timing. This accumulated experience meant that engagements involving M79s had become almost ritualized. The Americans would advance or patrol. Contact would be initiated. Within seconds, the squad leaders would be calling "Grenadier up." The grenadier would move forward, assess the target, fire. The distinctive bloop would echo through the jungle. 3 seconds later, the explosion. Then the NVA would either break contact and withdraw, or they would surge forward, trying to close the range. Every firefight played out variations on this theme. The M79 had become the centerpiece of American squad tactics, the weapon that turned static firefights into dynamic engagements. Before the M79, a squad pinned down by a machine gun had limited options. With the M79, they had a solution. Suppress the machine gun with rifle fire, bring up the grenadier, put 3 or 4 rounds on the position, problem solved. The statistics bore this out. After-action reports from 1967 showed that squads with trained grenadiers had significantly lower casualty rates than squads without. The presence of an M79 changed enemy behavior, forced them to be more cautious, more dispersed, less willing to stand and fight. But the cost was high. Grenadiers died at a rate 40% higher than regular riflemen. They were priority targets, they exposed themselves more often, and they carried distinctive weapons that marked them for enemy fire. The survival rate for grenadiers on their first tour was lower than almost any other infantry role except point man. By the time Michael Kern arrived in Vietnam in March 1967, the tactics had been refined through thousands of firefights and hundreds of grenadier casualties. The lessons learned had been written in blood. Staff Sergeant Price's notebook, the one Kern carried in his breast pocket, represented the accumulated wisdom of 2 years of brutal combat. Kern would add his own lessons to that collective knowledge, starting with his first firefight near fire support base buttons. The ambush that left Rodriguez wounded and taught Kern that the soft bloop of his weapon was both a lifeline for his squad and a death sentence for the enemy. The sound that North Vietnamese soldiers had learned to fear more than rifle fire, more than artillery, more than airstrikes. Because those other weapons you might survive through luck or good cover, but when you heard the bloop, you knew that death was already in the air, already falling, and all you could do was move and pray it landed somewhere else. Fire Support Base Buttons, South Vietnam, March 21, 1967. 6 days after the ambush, the firebase sat on a low hill scraped bare by bulldozers, a raw wound of red dirt surrounded by triple-strand concertina wire and fighting positions. 4 105mm howitzers squatted in sandbagged revetments at the center, their barrels pointed at different compass points like the spokes of a wheel. Around the perimeter, fighting positions connected by shallow trenches formed a defensive ring that looked, from the air, like a misshapen crown. Michael Kern sat in one of those positions, his M79 across his knees, watching the jungle that pressed in from all sides. It was 400 hours, that dead time before dawn when the world was nothing but shadows and sounds. His shift on perimeter guard would end in 2 hours. 2 hours of watching the tree line, listening for movement, trying to stay awake while his body screamed for sleep. 6 days since the ambush. Rodriguez had been medevaced out with a shattered femur. He'd live, but his war was over. Second Squad had received a replacement, a cherry named Williams who looked about 17 and flinched at every sound. The kid would learn, or he'd die. That was how it worked. Kern's hand rested on the buckshot round he kept ready, always ready now. Tucker's advice had been right about everything. The first firefight had been chaos, but the ones after, there had been 3 more contacts in the past 6 days, had become almost routine. Hear the AK fire, identify the source, call distance to Sergeant Patterson, fire, reload, fire again. The bloop explosion bloop rhythm that marked every engagement. He'd fired 42 rounds in 6 days, 14 HE, 2 WP, 1 buckshot when they'd stumbled into an NVA position at 30 meters. The buckshot had probably saved his life and the lives of 3 other men in the squad. The memories were already blurring together, different patches of jungle, different targets, same procedure. The jungle was never silent. Insects hummed, birds called in the canopy, things rustled in the undergrowth. Kern had learned to filter the normal sounds from the wrong sounds, the snap of a branch that was too loud, the absence of insect noise in a particular direction, the metallic click that might be a weapon safety being released. Right now, everything sounded normal, but normal meant nothing. The NVA owned the jungle at night. They could be 10 meters away, invisible, waiting. A hand touched Kern's shoulder and he nearly jumped out of his skin. He spun, M79 coming up, his thumb on the hammer. "Easy, Kern." Sergeant Patterson's voice, barely a whisper. "Just me." Kern lowered the weapon, his heart hammering. "Jesus, Sarge." "Got a patrol tasking. First light. 6-man recon. Sweep east toward that village." Patterson consulted a map with a red-filtered flashlight. "Ap Tan Hoa. Intelligence says there's been NVA activity. We're going to poke around, see what's there." "Who's going?" "You, me, Williams, Jackson, Miller, and Thompson, light and fast. 4 hours out, 4 hours back. We leave in 90 minutes. Kern nodded. 90 minutes meant no sleep. He'd been awake for 19 hours already, but that was the routine. Patrol, guard duty, patrol again, grab sleep when you could. His body had adapted to functioning on 4 or 5 hours of sleep a day, supplemented by coffee so strong it could strip paint and cigarettes that kept his hands busy. "How many rounds you carrying?" Patterson asked. 23, 18, HE, 3 WP, 2 buckshot. Make it 25, all he. If we hit something, I want maximum firepower." Kern pulled 2 more HE rounds from his reserve stash, slid them into his vest pouches. Each round was 8 ounces. The 2 extras added a pound. His body barely noticed anymore. He'd been carrying 60 to 70 pounds every day for weeks. The weight had become part of him. At 05:45 hours, as the sky was turning from black to gray, 6 men slipped through the wire and into the jungle. Thompson walked point, his M16 on safe, eyes scanning constantly. Jackson followed at 10 meters, then Patterson, then Kern, with his M79 loaded with buckshot for the first 100 meters. They'd be inside minimum arming range if they got hit during insertion. Miller and Williams brought up the rear. They moved slowly, carefully, placing each foot to minimize noise. The jungle was waking up around them, birds singing, monkeys chattering in the canopy, the rising heat already making Kern's uniform stick to his back. The patrol route followed a trail that intelligence had identified from aerial photos, a narrow path that wound through the vegetation toward the village 3 kilometers away. 30 minutes in, Thompson's fist went up. Everyone froze. Kern's hand moved to his vest, pulled out an HE round, kept the buckshot ready in his other hand. They were far enough from the firebase now that arming range wasn't an issue anymore. Thompson pointed down, boot prints in the mud, still fresh. Multiple people, moving east. The same direction as the patrol. NVA or VC. Certainly not friendlies. The tracks were maybe an hour old, judging by how much water had seeped back into the impressions. Patterson made a decision with hand signals. "Follow the tracks." The patrol adjusted, moving even more slowly now. They were hunting now, not just reconning. Every step was calculated, every sound analyzed. Kern switched rounds. Buckshot back in the vest, he in the chamber. If they made contact, it would probably be at range. Probably. The trail opened into a small clearing, maybe 20 meters across. On the far side, a hooch, a traditional Vietnamese dwelling made of bamboo and thatch. Abandoned from the look of it. No smoke, no movement, no sounds except the jungle. Too quiet. Kern felt it in his gut before his brain processed why. The birds had stopped singing near the hooch. The insects had gone silent in that specific area. Something was wrong. Patterson felt it too. His hand signaled danger, possible ambush. The patrol halted at the clearing's edge, using trees for cover. They waited, watching. 1 minute, 2 minutes. Nothing moved. Thompson made the tactical decision. He'd been in country 9 months, had the experience to trust his instincts. He aimed his M16 at the hooch and fired a single round. The shot cracked through the jungle silence. The hooch exploded. The whole structure detonated in a massive fireball that sent bamboo and thatch 50 feet into the air. A booby trap, probably rigged with mortar rounds or unexploded ordnance. If they'd approached it, half the patrol would be dead. But the explosion did something worse than kill them. It announced their presence to every NVA soldier within a kilometer. "Move! Back the way we came!" Patterson's whisper was urgent. They turned, started retreating along their own path. They'd gone maybe 50 meters when the jungle erupted with AK-47 fire from 3 sides. The ambush was textbook. The NVA had heard the explosion, guessed that an American patrol had triggered the trap, and moved to intercept. They'd set up in a hasty L-shaped ambush, catching the patrol in a kill zone with nowhere to go but backward. Miller went down in the first burst, hit in the shoulder and leg. Williams was screaming. Jackson and Thompson were returning fire, their M16s on full auto, burning through magazines. Patterson was on the radio calling for support, artillery, gunships, anything. And Kern was doing what he'd been trained to do. "Grenadier up!" Patterson's voice cut through the chaos. Kern was already moving, low-crawling toward a fallen log that offered minimal cover. He could see muzzle flashes in the jungle to his left, maybe 70 meters out. He broke open the M79, confirmed the HE round was seated, snapped it closed. The sight picture came automatically. 70 meters, dense vegetation, enemy in covered positions. He aimed high, accounting for the arc, and fired. Bloop. The sound seemed absurdly gentle compared to the hell breaking loose around him. He was reloading before the round even landed, breaking the action, extracting the spent casing, pulling a fresh HE from his vest. 3 seconds. The first round exploded in the tree line. He didn't know if it hit anything. He was already firing the second round at a different muzzle flash position. Bloop! Third round, fourth round. He was working mechanically now, no thought, just muscle memory. Target, aim, fire, reload. The explosions were walking through the enemy position, each one sending shrapnel screaming through the jungle. The AK fire from that side slackened. Right side! Right side! Jackson was yelling. Kern shifted his aim point, spotted more muzzle flashes to the right, maybe 90 meters. Farther, but still in range. He fired, reloaded, fired again. Bloop, bloop, bloop. The rhythm was almost mechanical. His hands were steady, his breathing controlled, despite the adrenaline screaming through his system. 8 rounds fired in less than a minute. The ambush was breaking up. The NVA hadn't expected this level of firepower from a 6-man patrol. They'd expected to overwhelm the Americans quickly. Instead, they were taking casualties from the grenade barrage, and American small arms fire was intensifying as the patrol fought back. "Cease fire! Cease fire!" Patterson's command. The jungle went quiet except for Miller's groaning and Williams' sobbing. Kern held his M79 ready, scanning for targets, but no more muzzle flashes appeared. The NVA had broken contact, melted back into the jungle. "Count off," Patterson ordered. 1, Thompson. 2, Jackson. 3, Kern's voice was steady. 4, Miller, through gritted teeth. 5, Williams, barely audible. Patterson made 6, everyone alive, 1 seriously wounded. Kern had 9 rounds left in his vest. He reloaded the M79 with a fresh HE round, kept it ready while the squad formed a defensive perimeter around Miller. The medevac Huey arrived 12 minutes later, the beautiful sound of rotor blades cutting through the humid air. Miller was strapped to a litter and loaded aboard. The rest of the patrol climbed in. Patterson had made the call to extract rather than continue the mission. The hooch explosion and firefight had compromised their position. Staying out would just invite another ambush. As the Huey lifted off, banking toward fire support base buttons, Kern looked down at the jungle. Somewhere down there, NVA soldiers were counting their own casualties, treating their own wounded, and reporting back to their commanders. They'd ambushed an American patrol and been driven off by superior firepower. And at the center of that firepower report would be the mention of the weapon that made the bloop sound, the grenade launcher that had put 16 rounds into their positions in under 2 minutes, forcing them to withdraw or die. 3 kilometers away, NVA base camp. Senior Lieutenant Pham Duc Quan listened to his squad leader's after-action report with growing frustration. Another failed ambush. Another engagement where the Americans' grenade launcher had turned the tide. "How many blooper rounds?" Quan asked. 16, Comrade Lieutenant, maybe more. They came very fast. Casualties? 3 killed, 5 wounded. 1 seriously. Comrade Tien has lost his leg. Quan did the arithmetic in his head. 8 casualties from 16 grenade rounds, a 50% hit rate. And those were just direct casualties. The suppressive effect had been significant enough to break the ambush. A 6-man patrol should have been easy prey. Instead, his squad had been forced to withdraw with heavy losses. "The grenadier," Quan said. "Did your men identify him?" "No, Comrade Lieutenant. He was in covered position. We could hear the bloop sound but could not see the shooter." This was the problem. The M79 allowed American grenadiers to fire from concealment, putting rounds on target without exposing themselves significantly. And the sound, that damned bloop sound, carried far enough that it was useless for pinpointing the shooter's exact location. Quan had been fighting Americans for 18 months. He'd learned to respect their firepower, their mobility, their support systems. But the grenade launcher was the weapon he feared most. Artillery could be avoided by staying dispersed and mobile. Airstrikes gave warning. You could hear the jets coming. Machine guns could be flanked or suppressed. But the blooper was personal, immediate, and devastatingly effective. One soldier with an M79 could dominate a firefight, could suppress multiple positions, could kill men who thought they were safe behind cover. "Next time," Quan told his squad leader, "do not initiate the ambush until you have identified and can immediately kill the grenadier. If you cannot kill him in the first burst, do not ambush at all. It is better to let them pass than to engage and take casualties." The squad leader nodded, but his expression was troubled. Identifying the grenadier wasn't always possible. American squads were learning to protect them, to keep them from being obvious targets. And the chaos of an ambush, the first few seconds when surprise was total, was often the only chance to inflict significant casualties. "The blooper changes everything," the squad leader said quietly. "We cannot fight the way we used to fight. Quan couldn't disagree. The tactical situation had evolved. 2 years ago, when American advisors first started appearing with M79s, his unit had treated them as curiosities. Now they were threat priority 2, right behind machine guns. Every tactical plan had to account for them. Every ambush had to include countermeasures. Every defensive position had to assume grenade rounds would be coming in. The Americans had found a weapon that perfectly suited this war's particular conditions. In the dense jungle of Vietnam, where engagement ranges were measured in tens of meters rather than hundreds, where visibility was limited and concealment was easy, the M79 gave American squads a decisive advantage. It was the weapon that forced the NVA to respect even small patrols, to think twice before initiating contact, to withdraw from fights they might otherwise have won. Fire support base buttons, 18:30 hours. Kern sat on sandbags outside his fighting position, cleaning his M79 with methodical care. The weapon had fired 24 rounds today, 16 during the ambush, 8 more during a brief contact on the extraction flight when the Huey had taken ground fire and he'd leaned out to return fire, pumping rounds at muzzle flashes from 200 feet up. His hands moved through the cleaning routine automatically. Break the action, run a bore brush through the barrel, wipe down the receiver, check the firing pin, oil the moving parts, reassemble. The weapon was simple, durable, hard to break, but taking care of it was a ritual, something concrete to focus on while his brain processed the day's events. Thompson sat nearby, cleaning his M16. "You know the gooks have a name for you?" Kern looked up. "What?" "Well, not you specifically. But grenadiers in general, captured documents say they call you blooper men, or sometimes bloop gun soldiers. Intelligence says it's one of the few American weapons they've given a specific nickname to." "Great. I'm famous with the enemy." "They're scared of you, man. That's what it means. They'd rather face our machine guns than your blooper. You saw how fast they broke contact today when you started dropping rounds on them." Kern had seen, had felt it, really. That moment when the incoming fire slackened, when the enemy made the decision to withdraw rather than continue the fight. His M79 hadn't done all of that. Jackson and Thompson's rifle fire had been critical, and the threat of helicopter support had played a role, but the grenade barrage had been the tipping point. 16 rounds, 4 casualties confirmed, Kern said quietly. "That's a 25% hit rate. Training says I should be hitting 70%. Training is in Georgia with stationary targets in clear weather. This is the jungle. You can't see shit, targets are moving, and people are shooting back. 25% is damn good." Maybe. Kern wasn't sure. What he was sure of was that 4 NVA soldiers were dead because of him. Direct cause and effect. He'd aimed his weapon, squeezed the trigger, and 3 seconds later, men had died. Their bodies were out there now, being recovered by their comrades or left to rot in the jungle. He'd killed before. The first ambush 6 days ago, the subsequent contacts. But today felt different. Today he'd seen the pattern clearly. Bloop. Explosion. Death. Bloop. Explosion. Death. A mechanical rhythm that he'd repeated 16 times without hesitation. "You did good today," Patterson said, walking up with a canteen cup of coffee. "Miller's going to be fine, by the way. Medevac radio said he'll keep the arm and leg. He'll be back stateside in a month." "Good." Kern accepted the coffee, sipped it. It was terrible. Instant coffee mixed with water that tasted like the chemical tablets used to purify it. He drank it anyway. "Tomorrow we go out again," Patterson continued. "Different sector. Intelligence thinks there's a supply cache near Hill 142. We're going to check it out." "Same loadout?" "Same loadout, but bring extra WP. If we find a cache, we're going to burn it." Kern nodded. He'd fire whatever rounds Patterson wanted him to fire, at whatever targets Patterson identified. That was the job. That was why he carried 25 pounds of ammunition and a weapon that marked him as a priority target for every NVA soldier in the province. That night, lying in his fighting position trying to sleep, Kern heard the distant bloop of another firebase's grenadier engaging targets. The sound carried for miles in the still night air. Somewhere out there, another American soldier was doing exactly what Kern had done today, putting 40mm rounds on target, killing enemies he couldn't see, protecting his squad with that distinctive gentle sound that meant death was in the air. And somewhere in the jungle, NVA soldiers were hearing that sound and diving for cover, knowing they had 3 seconds to move or die. The deadly dance continued day after day, firefight after firefight, the bloopers' rhythm marking time in the Vietnam War's endless symphony of violence. Firebase Buttons, South Vietnam. November 1967, 8 months after Kern's first firefight. Michael Kern sat on his bunk in the transient tent, his duffel packed, his M79 already turned into the armory. Tomorrow morning he'd board a C-130 to Bien Hoa, then a commercial flight to Travis Air Force Base in California, then home. His war was over. He'd survived. 364 days in country, 218 patrols, 47 firefights, 1,237 rounds fired from his M79. He'd kept count in a notebook, marking each engagement, each round, like an accountant tallying debits and credits in a ledger written in explosives and blood. The numbers told a story, but not the whole story. They didn't capture the weight of the weapon that had become an extension of his body. They didn't measure the psychological burden of being the man everyone screamed for when contact was made. They didn't quantify the nightmares where he heard the bloop sound in his sleep, followed by screams in Vietnamese. Specialist Williams, no longer a cherry, now a veteran with 8 months of his own experience, came into the tent carrying 2 beers liberated from the officers' club. "Figured you could use one." Kern took the beer gratefully. It was warm, but it was alcohol, and that was what mattered. "You taking over as squad grenadier?" "Yeah. Patterson's putting me through the quals tomorrow. Says I've watched you work enough times that I know what to do." "Keep your head down. Vary your firing positions. Always carry buckshot ready. Don't—" "I know, Kern. You've told me 100 times." Williams grinned. "Besides, you wrote it all down, remember?" He pulled out a notebook, Kern's notebook, the one he'd been keeping since training. Williams had copied every page. Kern had added to Staff Sergeant Price's original 20-item list. His version had 63 items, each one learned through experience, each one representing a lesson that had kept him or his squad mates alive. Things like, Item 47, in triple canopy jungle, aim lower than you think. The rounds clip vegetation on the way up and fall short. Or Item 52. If you hit a bunker and the round bounces off without exploding, it's probably too well reinforced. Mark it with WP and call for air support. "You gonna keep in touch?" Williams asked. "I don't know, man. Part of me wants to forget this place the second I get on that plane. Part of me knows I'll never forget it." Kern sipped his beer. "You'll do fine. You've got good instincts. Just remember, the weapon is simple, but the job is complicated. Every firefight is different." "What are you going to do?" "Back in the world. College, maybe. I've got the GI Bill. Study something that doesn't involve explosives." Kern tried to smile, but it came out wrong. "I've blown up enough things for one lifetime." They sat in silence for a while, drinking their warm beers, listening to the sounds of the fire base, generators humming, radio chatter from the talk, someone playing All Along the Watchtower on a tape player, the routine sounds that had become the background music of Kern's life for a year. "You ever wonder what they thought?" Williams asked suddenly. "The NVA. What it was like on the other side, hearing the bloop and knowing what was coming," Kern had wondered. "Many times. I think they were scared, same as us. They just had different weapons and different tactics, but the fear, that's universal. Intelligence says the NVA put out a training manual specifically about the M79. Whole sections on how to avoid it, how to identify grenadiers, how to counter it. We're in their textbooks, man." Kern hadn't known that, but it didn't surprise him. The M79 had changed infantry combat in Vietnam. He'd seen it himself, the way NVA tactics had evolved over his tour, the way they'd become more cautious about initiating ambushes, the way they'd started positioning their forces to minimize grenade effectiveness. "How many you figure you killed?" Williams asked. Then immediately, "Sorry, you don't have to answer that." But Kern had already done the math. 1,237 rounds fired, estimated hit rate based on after-action reports and confirmed casualties, 35%. That was 433 hits. Kill radius of 5 meters, but not every round killed everyone in that radius. Conservative estimate, 1.5 casualties per effective hit. That was 649 enemy casualties that could be directly attributed to his M79. 649 people, more than the population of the town where he'd grown up. Most of them young men, probably conscripts, following orders just like he was. Some of them had families waiting for them in North Vietnam, parents who would never know exactly how their sons had died, only that they'd fallen in the South, fighting the Americans. "I don't know," Kern said. "I tried not to think about it that way. I thought about it as suppressing enemy positions, protecting my squad, completing the mission. If I'd thought about it as killing people, individual people with lives and families, I don't think I could have kept doing it." Williams nodded slowly. "Yeah, I get that." The truth was more complicated. Kern had killed people, hundreds of them. He'd done it efficiently, mechanically, without hesitation, because hesitation got Americans killed. He'd done it because that was his job, his role, his purpose in the squad. And he'd done it well. Well enough that he'd survived when 43% of grenadiers in his battalion hadn't. Arlington, Virginia, May 1985, 18 years later, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial was crowded with people touching names, leaving flowers, taking rubbings. Michael Kern stood in front of panel 19E, looking at a name carved into the black granite, Raymond Price. Staff Sergeant Raymond Price, the instructor who'd trained Kern at Fort Polk, had gone back to Vietnam for a third tour in 1969. He'd been killed by a mine while on patrol in Quang Tri Province. The man who'd taught Kern to trust his instincts, to fire and move, to protect his squad at all costs, had died doing exactly that. Kern traced the name with his finger. He'd brought something, a worn notebook, Price's original 20-item list that Kern had carried through his entire tour. He'd thought about leaving it here, a memorial to the man who'd kept him alive, but in the end, he kept it. Price's knowledge had saved lives. It deserved to be remembered, passed on. A voice behind him. "You served?" Kern turned. A younger veteran, maybe mid-30s, wearing a 1st Cavalry Division cap. "Yeah, 67 to 68. You?" 70 to 71, 1st Cav, the 3 Corps. The veteran looked at the wall. "Lot of names." 58,000. Kern had looked up the statistics. 58,220 American dead. Somewhere between 1 and 3 million Vietnamese dead on both sides. Numbers that were almost incomprehensible. "What did you do?" the veteran asked. "Grenadier, M79. The veteran's expression changed. Recognition, respect. "The Blooper. Man, that weapon saved my ass more times than I can count. Our grenadier was this kid from Texas named Hernandez. He could drop around through a window at 200 meters. You guys were worth your weight in gold." Kern nodded. He'd heard variations of this sentiment before from other veterans. The grenadiers had been both respected and feared within their own units. Respected for their skill and the firepower they brought, feared because they attracted enemy attention. Walking near the grenadier meant you might catch rounds meant for him. "The NVA hated that weapon," the veteran continued. "I remember one guy we captured. He said the worst sound in the world was the bloop. Said it meant someone was about to die and there was nothing you could do to stop it, just 3 seconds to pray you weren't the target." This aligned with what Kern had learned over the years. In the 1980s, as the war became history instead of current events, scholars and researchers had started interviewing North Vietnamese veterans. The testimony was consistent. The M79 had been one of the most feared American weapons, second only to artillery and airstrikes. One captured NVA training document from 1969, translated and declassified, had an entire chapter titled "Countering the American Grenade Launcher." It recommended immediate dispersal upon hearing the characteristic firing sound, maximum spacing between soldiers, minimum 10 meters, emphasis on killing the grenadier in the first seconds of contact, and withdrawal if the grenadier's position could not be immediately identified and suppressed. The document noted that American grenadiers typically fired 15-25 rounds during an engagement, with an effective hit rate of 30 to 40%. It emphasized that a single grenadier could suppress an entire squad or even a platoon if the NVA soldiers were poorly positioned. It recommended that NVA units should consider breaking contact rather than continuing an engagement against a skilled grenadier. Fort Benning, Georgia, September 1995. The Infantry Museum had opened a new exhibit on Vietnam-era weapons. Michael Kern, now 51 years old, had been invited as a veteran advisor. He stood in front of a display case containing an M79 grenade launcher, various types of 40mm ammunition, and a grenadier's vest. The placard read, M79 grenade launcher, 1961-1971. Nicknamed the Blooper for its distinctive firing sound, the M79 filled the gap between hand grenades and mortars. It became one of the most effective squad-level weapons of the Vietnam War, with one grenadier assigned to each infantry squad. The M79 was eventually replaced by the M203, an under-barrel grenade launcher that attached to the M16 rifle. A high school group was touring the museum. Their teacher, a young woman in her 30s, was explaining the exhibit. The soldiers who carried this weapon were called grenadiers. It was considered one of the most dangerous jobs in the infantry because enemy forces would target them specifically. One of the students raised his hand. Did it really make a bloop sound? The teacher hesitated. Kern stepped forward. Yes, it did. I carried one in Vietnam. The student's attention shifted to him immediately. The teacher looked grateful for the expert input. Can you tell us about it? Kern looked at the M79 in the case. It looked smaller than he remembered, almost toy-like. But he could still feel the weight of it in his hands, could still remember the kick when it fired, could still hear that soft, hollow sound that had been the soundtrack to his war. It was simple to operate, Kern said. Break action, single shot. You loaded a 40mm round, aimed high to account for the arc, and fired. The sound, the bloop, came from the low-pressure propellant system. It was gentle, almost comical, but 3 seconds after you heard it, a high explosive round would detonate with enough force to kill everyone within 5 meters. Did you? The student hesitated. Did you kill people with it? The teacher looked embarrassed, started to reprimand the student for asking such a direct question, but Kern held up his hand. Yes, he said simply. That was my job. My squad would get ambushed, or we'd encounter enemy positions, and I would use this weapon to suppress them or destroy them. It wasn't personal, it wasn't about hate, it was about survival, my survival and my squad's survival. The North Vietnamese soldiers called it the Blooper too, Kern continued. They'd borrowed the name from us, and they learned to fear that sound, because it meant someone had just fired a weapon that could kill them, and the round was already in the air, already falling, and all they could do was try to get out of the kill radius before it landed. He paused, looking at the students' faces. They were trying to process this. War is something real, not something from movies or video games. The M79 was effective because of mathematics and psychology. The mathematics, it could put an explosive round precisely on target at ranges where rifles couldn't reach and mortars were too slow. The psychology? The sound announced that death was coming, but gave you just enough time to know it without enough time to do much about it. One of the students was taking notes. Is it still used? Not the M79 specifically. It was replaced by the M203, which mounted under the barrel of an M16 or M4 rifle. Same 40mm round, similar concept, but the grenadier could also carry a rifle. The M79 required you to carry a separate sidearm or rifle for self-defense. What Kern didn't say, what he couldn't quite articulate to high school students, was what it felt like to be a grenadier, the burden of being the most called-upon person in the squad, the weight of knowing that men's lives depended on your accuracy, the psychological toll of killing at a distance, where you heard the explosion but rarely saw the results directly. He didn't tell them about the nightmares that had persisted for years after the war, where he'd hear the bloop sound and wake up in a cold sweat. He didn't tell them about the guilt that came later when the adrenaline wore off and you had time to think about the fact that you'd killed hundreds of people, most of whom you'd never seen, whose faces you'd never know. He didn't tell them that even now, 28 years after his tour ended, certain sounds could trigger flashbacks. A car backfiring, a firecracker, even the hollow pop of a champagne cork. His brain had been trained to associate that particular sound with immediate action, and decades couldn't fully erase that conditioning. Hanoi, Vietnam, March 2005. The delegation of American and Vietnamese veterans sat in a conference room at the Vietnamese Ministry of Defense, part of a cultural exchange program aimed at reconciliation. Michael Kern, now 61, was among the Americans. Across the table sat several former NVA officers, including Senior Colonel Nguyen Van Thieu, not the same Thieu who'd encountered the M79 in 1965, but a namesake who'd fought from 1966 to 1975. Through a translator, the former enemies shared their experiences. The conversation was tentative at first, then gradually more open, as both sides realized they were talking to fellow soldiers who understood the reality of combat in ways that civilians never could. Colonel Thieu was describing NVA tactics when he mentioned the Sung Phong Lu, the grenade launcher. "We had great respect for this weapon," he said through the translator. "It was not the most powerful American weapon, but it was perhaps the most troubling. Artillery and airstrikes we could sometimes avoid by being mobile, by using tunnels. Machine guns we could suppress or flank, but the blooper," he used the English word, "was different." Kern leaned forward. "How so?" "It was immediate and personal," Thieu said. "When we heard that sound, we knew the round was already flying toward us. 3 seconds. That's all we had. Some men dove into holes, some ran, some froze and died. After a while, the sound itself became a weapon. Young soldiers would panic when they heard it, even if the round was not aimed at their position. We were trained to target grenadiers first," another Vietnamese veteran added, "before machine gunners, before officers. Kill the blooper man, and the American squad lost much of its firepower. But you were difficult to identify, and you were usually protected. It was not easy." Kern found himself nodding. "We were trained to expect that, to vary our positions, to fire and move, to blend in with the squad." "Did you fear our weapons?" Thieu asked. "The AK-47, Kern said immediately. "Reliable, simple, effective, and your tactics, the ambushes, the spider holes, the way you could appear and disappear. We had superior firepower, but you had superior knowledge of the terrain." The conversation continued for hours. Two groups of men who'd tried to kill each other 40 years ago, now sharing coffee and comparing experiences. Kern learned that NVA casualty estimates attributed approximately 15–20% of their combat deaths to grenade launchers, a staggering proportion for a weapon carried by only one soldier per squad. He learned that captured M79s were prized by NVA forces, but ammunition was scarce, and they often lacked training to use them effectively. He learned that the bloop sound had become legendary in North Vietnamese military culture, a sound that veterans still recognized instantly decades later. And he learned that the North Vietnamese soldiers hadn't been faceless enemies or fanatical communists, but scared young men doing their duty, just like he'd been. They'd had families, dreams, fears. They died in anonymous jungle clearings, blown apart by his 40mm rounds, and their families had grieved just like American families grieved. It didn't make the killing wrong or right. War was beyond such simple moral categories. It just made it human, comprehensible in a way that statistics and after-action reports never could be. Conclusion. The M79 grenade launcher served as the U.S. military's primary squad-level indirect fire weapon from 1961 to 1971, when it was gradually replaced by the M203. During that decade, it fundamentally changed infantry tactics and became one of the defining weapons of the Vietnam War. Statistical analysis of after-action reports suggests that M79s were responsible for approximately 750,000 to 1 million 40mm rounds fired in combat, resulting in an estimated 200,000 to 300,000 enemy casualties. The weapon gave American infantry squads a decisive firepower advantage in the close-range jungle combat that characterized much of the Vietnam War. But statistics don't capture the full story. The M79's impact was as much psychological as physical. The distinctive bloop sound became a recognized audio signature of American military presence, a sound that carried for hundreds of meters and announced that precision firepower was available. North Vietnamese and Viet Cong forces learned to fear that sound in ways they didn't fear rifle fire or machine guns because the sound meant death was already in flight. For the grenadiers who carried the weapon, men like Michael Kern, the M79 was both a burden and a lifeline. It marked them as priority targets for enemy fire. It required skill and courage to use effectively under combat stress. It placed them in a unique psychological position, killing enemies they usually never saw, delivering death from a distance with mechanical precision. And yet, those same grenadiers were among the most valued members of their squads. When contact was made, "Grenadier up" was often the first command shouted. The man with the blooper was the one who could break ambushes, suppress enemy positions, protect his squad mates. The casualty rates among grenadiers reflected their importance. They died at significantly higher rates than regular riflemen, but their presence reduced overall squad casualties by an even greater margin. The M79 was eventually replaced by the M203 underbarrel grenade launcher, which offered similar capabilities while allowing the soldier to also carry a rifle. But veterans of the M79 era argue that the dedicated grenade launcher had advantages: better accuracy, faster reload times, and the ability to carry more ammunition. Today, the M79 exists primarily in museums and in the memories of veterans on both sides of the conflict. The soft bloop sound is silent now, replaced by more modern weapon systems. But for those who heard it, whether firing it or fleeing from it, that sound remains immediately recognizable, a ghost echo from a war that shaped a generation. Michael Kern, now in his 80s, sometimes still thinks about the weapon he carried through the jungles of Vietnam. He thinks about the 1,237 rounds he fired, the missions he completed, the squad mates he protected. He thinks about the North Vietnamese soldiers he killed. Hundreds of them, young men with families and dreams who died because he was skilled at his job. The M79 gave him the power to kill efficiently, precisely, at ranges where traditional weapons were ineffective. It made him valuable to his unit and a target for his enemies. It saved American lives and ended Vietnamese lives. It was, in the end, exactly what its designers intended: an effective tool for killing people. That the tool made a comical bloop sound when it worked only made the whole thing more surreal, more Vietnam. A war where nothing made sense except survival, where the absurd and the horrific intertwined constantly, where a weapon nicknamed the Blooper became one of the most feared instruments of death in a conflict that killed millions. The North Vietnamese called it the Blooper too, adopting the American nickname because no other word captured the essence of the weapon as well. That soft, hollow sound, followed 3 seconds later by explosion and death. A sound that meant you dove for cover or you died. A sound that echoed through the jungles of Vietnam for a decade and echoes still in the memories of those who survived.